Hello everyone and welcome to the Frankly Speaking video interview series on youth participation. Today we are with Alex Farrow, LGBTQ plus activist and facilitator, and we are discussing the issues of power and his ideas on how funding could be organized better. Check it out.
My name is Alex, and Alex Farrow, and I come from kind of the youth sector kind of all my life, both as an activist, as a campaigner, but most recently, my work in the youth sector was around youth policy and youth participation, often bringing me into contact both with activists and youth-led organizations who were often trying to amplify the voices of young people, particularly on campaigns and issues that were important to young people. But also my work was very much supporting governments, often through the development of national youth policies to help change the situation for young people from a policy perspective. And often my work was to help bring those two things together, to raise youth civil society so that it could have a stronger voice within policy making. And so that was my job for a number of years. And more recently, I've been involved in working with charities in England, in the UK, and this new project that I'm part of, this LGBTQ funding circle, kind of is a culmination of lots of the experiences that I've been seeing through the youth sector, but also from civil society more widely. A couple of years ago, I was in Sri Lanka, and I was working with the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Royal Commonwealth Society, and I was facilitating a training with LGBTQ activists from across the South Asia and South Pacific. And what should have been a training focusing on gender ended up being kind of a really safe space for activists to share, perhaps for the first time, their true self, their LGBTQ identity, and to freely express themselves, perhaps for the first time. I mean, it's funny that we're here because, frankly speaking, this was them speaking really frankly about their identity and who they were. And for some of these young activists, they had never told anyone in the world that they were LGBTQ. They were working on kind of health rights or human rights. But really the lens was focusing on LGBTQ. What I was really struck by in Sri Lanka was the level of violence that these young activists were facing, this kind of interpersonal violence that they were facing on an almost daily basis. And whilst it was incredible to see these young people come out of themselves on this 6 days that we had in Colombo, what was terrifying was the thought of them going back home. And we sat in a circle on the final day, all of us in tears, because they were scared about going home, and we as facilitators were so nervous and anxious about what life would be like for them when they went back home. For many people, keeping themselves a secret is hard enough. It's really hard once you've shared that secret with others, and then you have to put yourself back in a box. And it was in that moment that I decided that I wanted to do something more directly to help these youth activists who were putting themselves at great risk on a daily basis to pursue justice and to fight for rights that they thought were really important. And yet, so often they had such little support in doing so. And from my previous work with youth policy, around youth policy and youth research, we knew that young people, particularly individual activists, are completely often excluded from being able to access financial resources. Often traditional funders require activists or youth organizations to be formally accredited with the government that is themselves oppressing them in order to be able to access money to be able to fight against the oppressive regime. And worth remembering that in this particular case, some of these young people will be activists in countries where it's the death penalty to be LGBTQ, or life imprisonment. So many human rights defenders face these challenges, but for them, they are really risking life and death, and yet they don't have access to basic support that would make a difference. So for me, I saw that there was an opportunity there, that actually these young people needed a very small amount of money to be able to continue their activism, but also to be able to better defend themselves through things like digital security training or online privacy protections that would secure their activism in a different way. At the same time, I saw, or when I came back from that experience in Sri Lanka, I really struggled to communicate to my friends who were from the LGBTQ community what it was like for our people exactly like us who were just happened to be born somewhere else. And it felt so disconnected from the rights and privileges and freedoms that we have in the UK and across Europe. And I didn't just want to find a model that basically raised some money and distributed that money to activists, though that would be a fine model in itself. What I wanted to do was find a model that both generated that money and that resource to activists, but also did it in a way that created stronger connection and solidarity amongst our community around the world. And that aspect for me is really important. So what we've ended up with in a very simple way is a funding circle where community members from the UK, donors, are putting in personal money into a shared pot. We're working with a small number of activists from my networks from around the world. And we give out small, unrestricted grants of up to £1,000 they don't need to submit receipts. We want to know the story, but we don't need accountability. But crucially, all of the donors who are chipping in money come together to make decisions on the applications that we receive. So they know the stories of those activists. They know exactly where that money is going. And therefore they know personally those people, and are therefore able to trust them in terms of giving that money without the kind of attachments or bureaucracy that often big funders, for fair reasons, often need to employ. Mm. So that's the model that we've got at the moment, and we're very much in the pilot stage. But I think that's probably the journey up until this point. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, we're not very good, whether this is on civil rights, on gender equality, on LGBTQ rights. We're not very good at remembering our recent past when it comes to activism. If we think about the rights that we enjoy in the workplace, for example, these rights 40, 50 years ago didn't exist, but we take them for granted that this is just the way in which we've always run stuff. When of course it isn't, and it isn't the way that many things happen already around the world. So I think some of the aim of this initiative is to remind particularly people in the UK who haven't had to struggle for those rights, though everyone has their own individual journey through that. But in terms of legal privileges, we haven't had, by and large, to fight for many of the rights and freedoms that we have. But we shouldn't take it for granted that these will remain, because we've seen countries where things don't, it's not a linear line of progress. We see that in the United States, for example, at the moment. And in other countries. But also, I guess I want people to take more responsibility for not just the rights that we have in this country, but also the responsibility to help others realize and claim those rights as well. And sometimes that puts us at risk of being on the other side. This actually calls on activist people in the UK to support people whose country consider them to be operating illegally, or to be undermining the state or the institutions. And we are saying, well, actually, our values call us to act in a different way. And we will stand in solidarity with people who share our values. And I think that's something that we should be trying to build across lots of different movements. We've seen that right now, actually, through Black Lives Matter. We're seeing people say, it's not enough for us just to agree with them. We have to proactively do something to further the rights of other people. And I think that's what I'm, I guess, trying to call people to act, to proactively help people claim their rights, not just tacitly support or kind of bystand. One of the struggles that I have seen, and I've been in the youth sector for quite a long time now, is we start our journeys as activists and campaigners, often as youth activists, and we know that the system doesn't work for us. Like, we know we don't have equal access to funding or to resources or to power or to decision makers. And we campaign and we lobby and we work really hard to try and fight against it. But there are a number of us who make that flip from being activists to being on the inside, like to working in established organizations, to work for big funders or foundations or institutions. And we quickly forget ourselves and we think, well, what can I do? Well, actually, if we are in institutions, we have a power to be able to do something different. We shouldn't lose that spirit. Even if we're not young anymore, we're not youth activists anymore, we have to flip to then decide, how am I going to use my power to better further the causes that I once was part of, but that still want to see progress on. So if I'm a funder, how can I free up the bureaucracy and the systems in order for us to be able to better support youth activists with funding? If I'm a researcher, how can I try to amplify those perspectives so that people who are making decisions based on evidence listen to actually the causes that we know? If I'm a trainer or facilitator, how am I directly supporting people to build up their own capacity in their local context and give them some of the resources needed to organize better and more efficiently? So I think we can all do something, but I think the key thing is us to stand back and reflect. What was it that we were pushing towards? What is now in our gift? Because our power is different when we're in our 30s working in institutions than it was when we were in our teenage years fighting from the outside. How do we use that for the same cause?